Hello, Mark here. Before we begin today's episode, I would just like to quickly take the time to ask all of those who are enjoying the series a favour. If the platform you use to listen to Castings for Ancient Greece has a rating or review system, I would be extremely grateful if you would consider leaving the series a quick review. These ratings and reviews go a long way into helping others discover the show, in turn helping it grow. So if you enjoy the series and can spare a few minutes, I would love to read what you have to say about your experiences with the show. Thanks everyone for your support, and let's get to today's episode. What made the war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. Thucydides. Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Castings for Ancient Greece, episode 73, Causes for War. Well, we are finally at the point where the Peloponnesian War has broken out. As we have seen, this was not a straightforward path to where war would erupt. We had seen through the series that Athens and Sparta had a long history of mistrust and suspicion of one another. This has gone back even before the Greek and Persian War developed. Though, with Persia's invasion of Greece, the two had come together in a common cause, even though we would still see a number of times where they would disagree, almost leading to a breakup of the Hellenic League. However, it would be after the Persian invasions that we would see these suspicions come to the forefront once again, now that their common enemy had been defeated. These tensions would be far more pronounced now, since Athens had grown in influence and power due to the events through the Greek and Persian War. This influence and the departing interests would see Athens create its own league outside that of the Hellenic League, where many city-states and islands would join. Sparta would still possess its Peloponnesian League, but this would now start to see two main areas of control develop in the Greek world. Athens' Delian League would continue to mount its defence of Greece from Persia through its operations in the Aegean, though it wouldn't be long before these operations would not just target the Persians, but would also see Greeks themselves being the target. This would all be explained through protecting Greece by extension, as Athens looked to secure lines of trade and strategic locations, while responding militarily to revolts within their own league was due to making sure the league would not fall apart. So to prevent it from falling apart and not be in a position to respond to any future Persian threats. With continued operations, Athens would get into a position where they would start to overextend themselves. They would become involved in campaigns on Cyprus, Egypt, and would see what is known as the First Peloponnesian War break out, when Athens and Sparta's interests on the mainland would begin to overlap. Athens would find itself mainly fighting Sparta's allies, Corinth being a major one, but Sparta would face Athens on the battlefield a few years into the war, and almost again when they would invade Attica. However, it would be here that a truce was negotiated, and what was known as the 30 Years' Peace would come into being. We would continue to see the suspicion play a role in Athens and Sparta's approach to each other, as they continued their policies. It would appear that it would be the factions that controlled influence in their cities that would see further conflict avoided for the time being. Pericles had put an end to further Athenian expansion on the Greek mainland, while the peace party in Sparta would have restraint helping guide their policies when it came to interstate relations. However, with the developments far away from both Sparta and Athens, we would see the seed planted for the future conflict that would develop. At the centre of this development would be Sparta's ally, Corinth, and its colonies. Athens would be brought into the matter when Corcyra, on the opposing end of the dispute with Corinth, would approach Athens for help. This would end up seeing Athens and Corinth engage during the naval battle of Sparta. Though, if this was a breach of the 30 Years' Peace, this was up for debate. The situation would further degenerate. With a siege, Athens would find itself having to commit to around Plataea, another of Corinth's colonies. However, the crisis would come to a head when Sparta would hold an assembly and then a congress to settle on if Athens was in breach of the 30 Years' Peace. By the end, with all their allies putting their cases forward, it would be decided this was the case, and it appears the Peloponnesian League had also voted for war with Athens. Sparta would then proceed to send a series of ultimatums to Athens, where they would all be rejected. However, conflict had not yet developed. This would come when Thebes, part of the Peloponnesian League, would attempt to take the polis of Plataea, an ally of Athens. The attempt would turn out to be a disaster for Thebes, with all their troops that had entered the city being executed after their capture. Though, what this engagement had done would see that the Peloponnesian War had now begun. This action was a clear breach of the 30 Years' Peace in Athenian eyes, while Sparta recognised war was now at hand, both now on a war footing. So now that we are at this point in history, I want to take a step back from the events that are developing for this episode, and turn to a question that has been asked since the war begun. What caused the Peloponnesian War? A couple of episodes ago, I said this would be a question that hopefully we could answer, or at least provide some credible theories on. Now that we have looked through all the developments of the period, not only the events of the last couple of episodes, but going back to the Greek and Persian War, we can now interpret the events with this question in mind. So for this episode, we're going to explore such things as Thucydides' own views on the causes of war, while we'll explore the concept of the remote and immediate reasons for war, an often used way of viewing the lead up to the conflict, starting with Thucydides. However, is this a helpful way to view the matter, or should we be viewing these aspects in relation to one another to understand why war would end up developing? So hopefully, at the end of this episode, you'll have a better understanding of the impacts that led to war, and perhaps even draw some conclusions on why the Peloponnesian War came about. So let's get on with our look at the causes of a war, and begin with Thucydides and his view of the war. Thucydides states very early on in his work what he believes to be the reason for the Peloponnesian War. This is where he introduces the subject matter he will be focusing on in his work. He begins this section by outlining how the Peloponnesian War would be the greatest war the Greeks would engage in, even surpassing that of the Persian War, where he says, "The greatest war in the past was the Persian War. Yet in this war the decision was reached quickly, as a result of 2 naval battles, and 2 on land. The Peloponnesian War, on the other hand, not only lasted for a long time, but throughout its course brought with it unprecedented suffering for Hellas. Never before had so many cities been captured and then devastated, whether by foreign armies or by the Hellenic powers themselves. Never had there been so many exiles, never such loss of life." After outlining his reasons for choosing to focus on the Peloponnesian War, and why it was the greatest conflict the Greek world had yet seen, he then moves on to explaining the point at which the war would break out. He tells us this being due to the breakdown of the 30 Years' Peace, where he interestingly says, "War began when the Athenians and the Peloponnesians broke the 30 Years' truce." Here, he doesn't single out either Athens or Sparta breaking the peace, but seems to suggest that they both had a role in this aspect of war developing. Thucydides then moves on to addressing the reasons for the war developing, where he says that he will first give an account of the causes of complaint between the two sides, and where their interests overlapped. This, he says, making it obvious why war would fall upon Greece. Though he does go on to say that the real reason for war is likely to be disguised by such arguments, with him then giving us his opinion on the real reason for war. What made the war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. So, as we can see, these opening passages by Thucydides give us somewhat of a vague reason for the war developing, and many more questions in trying to understand why war came about. Many have tried to explore what Thucydides writes about to try and pinpoint an exact reason for the war, and even who was responsible for it developing. From the single sentence reason he gives us, camps have developed on who started the war, where some focus more on the growth of Athenian power and the impact they had on the Greek world, where others look towards Sparta, choosing to focus more on the fear that developed in Sparta due to this Athenian growth, and how Sparta would react to this. But there is also the view that it takes 2 to tango, with it difficult to lay the blame solely at the feet of one power. As for trying to pinpoint an exact reason where war was inevitable, we may be fighting a losing battle here, as it is common for a series of events, developments, and conditions to be present for war to come about. So perhaps offering a vague reason in a single sentence is the best we can hope for when attempting to provide a simple answer to this question. I think Thucydides understood this very well, and that is why he offers us this reason at the start of his work, where he then spends all of Book 1 giving us an account of the events and developments occurring after the Persian War, up to the breakout of the Peloponnesian War. This would serve to fill in all those nuanced reasons that would fall within his real reason for war. This reminds me of times where I've often been asked a generalised question on something to do with Greek history, and my response has often been, "How long do you have?" Or, "Would you like the short answer or the long answer?" I think Thucydides decides to give us his short answer to begin with, but then continues on to elaborate on the answer once he has your attention. For most of us who have an interest in history, often the short answer leaves us unsatisfied, and often with more questions rather than having it answered. Luckily for us, Thucydides gives us the long answer, though we may not be able to find a specific reason within this answer. However, we can hopefully walk away with an understanding of events, developments and conditions that would lead to war, so when someone asks what caused the Peloponnesian War, we will in turn say, how long do you have? We have covered the period that explains the developments leading to the Peloponnesian War in the last 20-odd episodes. This being done through our narrative approach, but now we are going to turn to some of these areas as we look at certain themes and views that would look to explain the causes of the Peloponnesian War, some of these having stronger arguments than others. We will first turn to the notion of the remote causes for war, before then turning to the immediate causes. So we are first going to look at the remote causes for the Peloponnesian War, these being developments in the past that would be seen to lead to conditions of war developing. It would appear on the surface that Thucydides' reason for the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta would fit into this remote view on the causes of war, though some even look further back than this, even before the Persian Wars. This would be seen to begin with the development of democracy in Athens, more specifically around the time of Cleisthenes. During this period we saw Sparta would interfere in Athenian politics on 4 separate occasions. The first would be in 511 BC, at the time when Athens had been ruled by tyranny, with Hippias in power at this stage. The noble family, the Alcmeonidae, had been exiled from Athens, who had been hugely influential before tyranny had come about when Athens was ruled by aristocrats, in an oligarchic system of government. The Alcmeonidae would bribe the Oracle of Delphi to tell the Spartans, whenever they came seeking advice, to tell them it was their duty to liberate Athens from their tyranny. At this time, Sparta had a reputation for liberating cities from tyrants, these in their eyes being very unpredictable forms of government, since they rested on public support. Sparta would end up marching on Athens, but would be defeated this time around by Hippias, largely thanks to support from his Thessalian allies. Sparta would then again invade Attica in 510 BC, where a much larger force would be sent. This time around they would besiege Hippias up on the Acropolis, where he would end up surrendering and going into exile in Persia. Sparta would then once again become involved in Athenian politics in 507 BC, during the wake of the downfall of the tyranny in Athens. This would be at a time when different political factions in the aristocratic classes were competing for influence. The 2 main factions to emerge were headed by Isagoras and Cleisthenes. Isagoras' faction were pro-Spartan and were oligarchic in nature, while Cleisthenes was promising democratic reforms to the people. Cleisthenes was becoming more popular due to his promises, where it looked as though his faction would become to govern Athens. Isagoras, seeing he was losing ground, then turned to Sparta for support. Cleomenes, the Spartan king, would be able to secure the exile of Cleisthenes through diplomatic means, and would send a small bodyguard force to Athens when Isagoras requested further support. In addition to this, some 700 families connected to Cleisthenes would also be expelled from Athens, while attempted measures were taken to narrow the political systems, so Isagoras would have control over all the political organs. This, however, would overstep the mark, and the Athenians, even without Cleisthenes' faction and supporters, would revolt, taking Isagoras and Cleomenes by surprise. They would take refuge on the Acropolis, where after 3 days, Cleomenes would surrender, where he and his men were allowed to leave. Isagoras not so lucky, he and his supporters would be murdered. This episode had embarrassed Cleomenes, and by extension Sparta, where a coalition effort, led by Sparta, would be directed at Athens. Cleisthenes was now back in Athens leading Athenian politics, where in 506 the Spartan campaign to invade Attica would get underway. Though disagreements between the 2 Spartan kings and their allies would see that the Spartan-led force would disintegrate. This would leave Sparta's other allies to act alone and would be defeated easily by the Athenians. These interventions by Sparta into Athenian politics would become somewhat of a point of embarrassment for the Athenians, as well as something they would come to resent. In the cases of the 511 and 510 invasions, this had shown that Athens was only able to rid themselves of their tyrannical rule through help from Sparta, who had to assist militarily on Athenian soil. Athens would try and play down Sparta's role in the affair with the elevation of 2 figures of Harmodius and Aristogiton, who had murdered Hippias' brother Hipparchus a few years earlier. They would become to be celebrated as the tyrannicides, elevating their role in the downfall of the tyranny. However, the Spartan interference in 507 would see Athenian resentment towards Sparta rather than embarrassment. This had gone far beyond liberating a city from a repressive rule. This in the Athenian people's eyes was a foreign state influencing their politics and way of life. It seems from Herodotus' account, it wasn't the act of exiling Thucydides that saw a revolt break out, but rather the attempt at altering the political system that would allow for a regression of Athenian politics to its days of oligarchic rule. There was also another element of resentment present during these events, where it appears Athens may have gone seeking Persian support in the face of a Spartan threat. If this was the case, we can see how this would have inflamed tensions further, as Sparta had been known for toppling pro-Persian governments in Greece during the Archaic period. Anyway, this is a quick look at some of the earliest remote causes for suspicion and contention between Sparta and Athens. Let's now move along the timeline a little more to just after the victory over Persia. Do you want more casting through ancient Greece episodes? Well, I have some good news for you. If you have been enjoying the series and wish to support the show over at Patreon, you can gain access to many bonus episodes, with new ones being added each month. Not only will you be gaining more content, but you will be helping the series grow. These bonus episodes have been taking a deeper dive on subjects we have covered briefly in the series so far. We began at the start of the Greek timeline and have been moving forward, this seeing us having covered topics around prehistory, the Bronze Age, and the Archaic Age. We are now turning to focus on the Greek and Persian War period, with us beginning with the Ionian Revolt. Here we'll be putting in focus through different episodes the early contact between the Greeks and Persians, motivations behind the Ionian Revolt, the Persian counter-offensive of the revolt, and then a focus on the final battle of Lade. If you are interested in gaining access to these bonus episodes, please consider heading over to the Casting Through Ancient Greece Patreon page. Not only will you get monthly bonus episodes, but you'll receive early access and ad-free series episodes. Other options also include access to fully referenced transcripts of the series episodes, as well as a forum, where members' questions are answered every month via video. Alternatively, you can visit the Casting Through Ancient Greece website, where you can find the Patreon link, as well as other ways that help the series grow, when clicking on the Support the Series button. Thank you all for listening to the series, and I look forward to perhaps seeing you over on Patreon. We had seen that although Athens and Sparta had their differences and had developed suspicions of one another, they would come together to face a common threat. This would be the Persian invasions, with perhaps the second invasion more so. Athens had sought Spartan help before the Battle of Marathon with the first Persian invasion, but it would only be Athens and Plataea that would face the Persians on the Greek mainland. However, we have explored how this first invasion may have been an extension of combating the revolt that had developed in Ionia. Now though, with Xerxes' invasion coming in 480 BC, a number of Greek cities would come together to defend their lands. Sparta and Athens would be the two largest of the city-states, though Sparta would take the leading role since the majority of the members of the Hellenic League would come from Sparta's Peloponnesian League. There would be episodes of fierce disagreement at times within the League as the Persian invasion advanced, these appearing to come due to the interests of the various cities, with geography playing a major role. Though the Hellenic League would be victorious in their defence of Greece, and it is at this point where we see the different interests come back to the forefront and set in motion new developments. As we have spoken about many times, the Persian invasion would see both Athens and Sparta have an immediate interest that aligned. But once the Persians had been defeated on the Greek mainland at Plataea and on the coast of Anatolia at Mycale, they would view the situation differently, and their separate interests would become apparent once again. For Sparta, the Persian threat had been dealt with, since there was no longer a Persian army within Greece, and none on the edge of the Aegean in striking distance. As we have seen, Spartan interests, for the most part, centred around Sparta and the surrounding regions. This would be encapsulated in the Peloponnesian League that they headed, and gave them great influence within the Greek world. Like Sparta, the League's interests were also mainly within the Peloponnese. So Sparta needed to not only look out to their own direct interests, but also that of the League and its members. Otherwise, they could risk seeing the League shrink, as members look for better support and protection elsewhere. During the Persian invasion, this idea of Spartan and Peloponnesian interests being much closer to their homelands was particularly highlighted during the periods where they would argue for abandoning their position at Artemisium and Salamis, in favour for setting a defensive line on the Corinthian Isthmus, the most northern part of the Peloponnese. For Athens, however, their interests were quite different, where not only did they have direct interests in Attica, but they had interests that were much further afield, this mainly in the trade routes through the Hellespont to the Black Sea. This route was a major reason Athens could support such a large population, this being abnormally large for a Greek polis. A great deal of their grain would come through this route, with Attica only being able to support a fraction of the population. Athens would also have a number of trading partners along the Anatolian coast, of whom would share the Ionian heritage. So, by extension of these interests, Athens also had a desire to ensure the Aegean and the eastern coastlines were secure and free from hostile influence. So, by the end of the Persian War, Athens and Sparta had some very different interests that did not align much. This seeing them departing from the agreement formed during the Persian threat. Not only this, but Sparta emerged from the war with still a reputation for one of the strongest land armies on the Greek mainland, while they would also control an alliance with many Peloponnesian allies, most in close proximity to themselves. While Athens would emerge as a great naval power, this now expanding its connections to places further away. It is this connection to the sea and the trade in the eastern Aegean that would then go to fuel the further growth of Athens, with them forming their own league, that would come to be described as an empire. It is this period of the remote causes that is often looked to as beginning the road to war, where we would find Thucydides' statement, the growth of Athenian power, and the fear which this caused in Sparta, being most aligned with. This would be the period where Athens would break away from the league formed with Sparta to form their own. Originally, many new members of the Hellenic League, those in the eastern Aegean, pushed for Athens to take on a more leading role now that they had more support. However, it would be decided that the interests and focus of those within the Hellenic League did not all agree on a single policy when it came to defending against the Persian threat. This would see all those with a vested interest in the eastern Aegean look to form a new league that would look out for their shared interests here, which would lead to the formation of the Delian League. The idea had been that all were on equal terms, but Athens had a leading role in many matters, while they would easily be able to influence smaller members to vote the way they wanted them to. We have covered how the League evolved over time in a number of episodes through its operations, so I'll not go over that again. However, what this had done was see the influence and growth and power dramatically increase. Unlike the Peloponnesian League, the Delian League was collecting money every year from its members, this ensuring ships and men could always be ready to be called upon. We would also see, as time went on, Athens was able to spread its influence into many of the members of the League, where we would now start to see the League as an Athenian empire. Athens had garrisons through much of the area it controlled, along with political representatives that would maintain close contact with the various members' governments. Not only this, but Athens would take the major step of transferring the treasury of the League from the island of Delos to Athens, where they would begin using some of the funds for their own use. With Athens' power on the increase, it's in this period that we also start to see some interactions take place between Athens and Sparta, both on the diplomatic front as well as through more direct means. One of the first instances we see Sparta contemplate action against Athens was during Athens' siege on Thassos in 465 BC. We even called our episode on this action Thassos, the path to conflict, since it would be the first time since the Persian Wars we would hear of an action against Athens being debated on in the Peloponnesian League. Thassos had sought aid from Sparta, who would supposedly agree to invade Attica in support of the island. We had seen Sparta had become concerned with Athenian growth even by this early stage, this being due to the policies of Themistocles, who had been interfering in the cities on the Peloponnese politically. However, this attack would not eventuate, due to a great earthquake rocking the Peloponnese and devastating Sparta. This would then lead to another interaction between Athens and Sparta that would see relations deteriorate. The earthquake that hit Sparta would also lead to a Helot revolt breaking out, this appearing to be a major crisis for Sparta. They would send for aid to many of their allies, with also a plea for assistance making its way to Athens. Once a number of the cities including Athens came to Sparta's aid, it appears much campaigning had been going on in Messenia, where it is thought Athens may have had some interactions with the Helots other than fighting them. We are unsure what really happened here, but Sparta would turn around to the Athenians and request that they would leave their lands, with no explanation given in the sources. It is often thought that Sparta had become very suspicious of Athens' intentions now that they were in their lands, and perhaps saw they may have sympathies with the revolting Helots. This episode would see Spartan suspicions highlighted towards Athens, while Athens would see that they had been treated very disrespectfully on the Greek diplomatic stage. This, in Athens, would lead to the pro-Spartan figure Cimon being ousted from a leading position and sent into exile, with now an anti-Spartan faction in power. This breakdown in relations would lead to the breakout of the First Peloponnesian War in 460 BC, where we would see Athens really pushing their influence into areas of Spartan and Peloponnesian interests in a much more aggressive way. However, Athens would not be alone here, with Sparta interfering in northern Greece, and it appears looking to support Thebes in uniting a Boeotian League under their leadership. A direct conflict would develop between Sparta and Athens, where they would meet on the battlefield at Tanagra. Although seen as a Spartan victory, Athens would very quickly continue campaigning into areas of the Peloponnese and other areas of their interests. As well as the various operations the Athenians were conducting within Greece, they had also committed a sizable force to assist a revolt taking place in Egypt. I'm not going to go back over all the events of this period, as there is a lot going on and it becomes very complicated. However, the main takeaway from this First Peloponnesian War is that it was a period where we saw governments and policies in both Athens and Sparta that were hostile to one another during the same period. This would also be the first time where we see both engaging in activities in each other's regions of influence, knowing full well what they were doing. Although Athens had a lot of success in the first years of the war, it would be in 454 BC when their Egyptian expedition ended in disaster, where they would recognise that they had severely overextended themselves. With it appearing both sides were now growing tired of the war, a truce would be negotiated. This appearing to be possible due to elements friendly to each city taking part in the negotiations. Cimon, who we know of having friendly ties to Sparta, would finish his exile in 451 and would head an Athenian delegation sent to Sparta. A truce of 5 years would be agreed upon, and Athens would use this period to address their policies that had seen them overextend themselves. This would also be where we would see many of the more controlling elements within their league take place, where we could see league now transfer into empire. However, the interfering in mainland Greece would continue, with Sparta involving themselves in issues over control at Delphi. This would see Sparta and Athens both getting involved, but at separate times, so that they would not encounter one another during the truce. However, around the time that the truce came to an end, Athens would be facing revolts in Euboea and Megara, who had previously been a Peloponnesian ally. While Athens was dealing with these, Sparta would take the opportunity to invade Attica, with it seeming another battle between the two powers was going to take place. Though, before the Spartan force reached Athens, an agreement would be struck, and the Spartans would return home. It is often thought here that a bribe was paid to the Spartan king to avoid them marching onto Athens. Though, what would result out of this would be the creation of the 30 Years' Peace, designed to try and draw a line in the sand where Athenian and Spartan interests overlapped. During the whole period, each other's interference in what the other saw as their region was what was leading to much of the conflict continuing. It appears by this stage, Athens, as well as Sparta, were not interested in fighting, as it was draining both cities' resources and attention from securing their position within their own territories and leagues. The agreement would see an understanding towards the status of various cities that had been at the heart of the disputes within the conflict. There would be an understanding that the allies of each power would be out of bounds politically to each other, though neutral cities could make alliances with whoever they liked. If there were future disagreements to arise, both Athens and Sparta agreed that arbitration would be their first action rather than force. This 30 Years' Peace effectively saw Greece divided into two main spheres of influence that we now officially defined. Although it had created two power blocks with different interests to each other, it also made the rules around geopolitics much more defined. This period of peace would be tested on occasion, with one of the biggest tests coming when Athens was dealing with the revolt of Samos in 440-439. Samos had requested Spartan help, and we are told by Thucydides that Sparta at the time was in favour of helping. However, when the matter was brought to the Peloponnesian League Conference, Corinth would argue against any intervention, their decision having quite some weight since they would provide the navy. But the 30 Years' Peace would hold firm, continuing on into the mid-430s, where we then start transitioning in what would be considered the more immediate causes of the Peloponnesian War. It's also interesting to note here that with the often cited growth of Athenian power and imperial ambitions being at the centre of why war broke out, these ambitions seem to have tailed off since the end of the First Peloponnesian War. We had seen that Athens had overextended themselves during it and had changed policies to put more of a focus on securing their position in the Aegean and strengthening their empire. They had made it policy to not focus on adding any new possessions, this being in effect for at least a decade before the immediate causes that we're about to turn to would start to develop. It is for this reason that some have seen these developments of the roughly 4 years leading to the breakout of war having more of an impact on the war developing. I don't want to go into all the details of what was developing over this period, since we have recently dealt with it. Rather, we will focus on how Athens and Sparta were becoming more intertwined in the unfolding events. Even though there are those that see these immediate developments to be the main reason for war breaking out, we need to keep in mind that certain conditions needed to be present for them to create tension. For this reason, what we brought up when looking at the remote causes are still valid, as they would see levels of suspicion and mistrust already in place to be acted upon. As we saw, the affair that begun at Epidamnus, north in Albanian lands, would be the point where these immediate developments would seem to begin. However, at this stage, Athens nor Sparta were involved. It would be the political troubles of the small polis of Epidamnus that would begin to snowball, seeing the situation become more volatile. Though, with the matter not resolving, Epidamnus would seek assistance from Corcyra, who had been the original founder of their city. Though, with their refusal to assist in matters, an even larger power would be approached, Corinth. This would see overlapping interests between Corcyra and Corinth now enter into the mix, which would then see the situation escalate with Corcyra's next move. After the two had engaged in a naval battle and Corcyra victorious, Corinth was in no mood of backing down. This is where we would see Athens approached by Corcyra to become an ally of the island and help protect them from further Corinthian attacks. Diplomatic talks would take place over Athens becoming involved in the matter. Their decision to enter into the situation would see tensions increase and now a new layer added to developments. Athens saw that they could not stand by and potentially see Corcyra defeated by Corinth. If so, this would see the two of the largest fleets in Greece behind Athens being united under Corinthian control. Corinth is part of the Peloponnesian League, and there appears to be a level of tension existing between the two, especially since the episode around Megara during the First Peloponnesian War. So although Athens was looking to secure their position in the seas around Greece, they are inserting themselves into a situation that would be viewed by Corinth as interfering in their business and area of influence. It seems at this stage, most on the geopolitical front saw Athens' involvement would be the deterrence needed to bring the situation between Corinth and Corcyra under control. Even Sparta had advised Corinth to display restraint, where they at this stage appeared to still be in a position where the peace party's policy was more popular. Athens had not been interfering in Spartan interests, as had been outlined in the 30 Years' Peace. However, Corinth would campaign against Corcyra, which would see developments occur that would muddy the waters further. This had seen Athens engage in direct combat with Corinthian ships. Athens had been under instructions not to act against Corinth unless under the direst circumstances. This had left a situation with questions over if the 30 Years' Peace had been broken. Athens looked to maintain its integrity, but as the situation developed further, Corinth would take advantage of Athenian actions to attempt to get more cities involved in combating Athens. Corinth now had much greater motivation to seeing conflict develop, since a number of their interests were now under threat from Athens. The next step that would see Corinth look to bring Sparta into the developments politically was with the action around Plataea. Athens appears to have been addressing a couple of threats here, as Plataea was on the Chalcidides and a major city in the region to support Athenian influence there. However, the region bordered Macedonian lands, where the current king Perdiccas was hostile towards Athens, while Plataea had been founded by Corinth and still retained some ties. This would see Athens looking to secure their hold here by removing Corinthian influence, as they were afraid that Corinth might incite the city to rebel, while they also looked to make it more defensible in the face of any Macedonian threat. Though as we saw, Athenian attempts to do something about securing the region seems to have made their worries a reality, this being somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. This would result in Sparta being lobbied to put an end to what Corinth and a number of the allies saw as Athenian imperial ambitions, and involving themselves in the independent affairs of other Greeks. This would put more pressure on Sparta and would see that the war party within their own government start to gain traction in leveraging these issues brought forward to them. Athens' interference in Peloponnesian League's members' interests, even though not directly Spartan, were now having an impact on Sparta and their role in the matter. This was due to the fact that more and more Peloponnesian allies were coming to Sparta with grievances against Athens. If this was left unchecked on Sparta's part, their ability to protect their allies would be undermined. This inaction is what Corinth used to leverage their position, and would see that the war party in Sparta gain more influence. It's this divide of restraint from the peace party and the anti-Athenian view of the war party in Spartan politics that Corinth would look to drive a wedge into. The imperial ambitions of Athens would be cited by the war party as a threat that needed to be dealt with, and would come to convince the Spartans and other Peloponnesians to vote for war. It would appear that it would be these immediate threats that Athens supposedly posed that would see the attitude in Sparta slowly change to a mood for war. Though it seems this fear of Athenian growth would be used politically to shift opinion, there were still those in Sparta that saw restraint as the best path forward. The Athenian threat to the Greek world, we could argue, was exaggerated in an attempt for Corinth, as well as the Spartan war party, to achieve their political aims. And even if there was some sort of mood for restraint still existing in Sparta, it didn't help that Athens would reject every ultimatum put forward to them. So, we have covered over a summary of what could be seen as the remote causes for war, as well as the more immediate ones. However, to try and rest the breakout of the war on one or the other, I think is just too simplistic, let alone looking to blame one particular aspect. For the remote causes would lead to situations that would develop due to the history between Sparta and Athens, though many of these developments would not be foregone conclusions, as we have seen due to the political restraint both were able to maintain, especially when the 30 Years' Peace was signed. As for the immediate causes, pre-existing conditions needed to exist for these recent developments to cause the levels of tension they did. Some modern historians would go as far to suggest more narrow views that would lead to war breaking out, such as economic reasons, differences in political systems, and even the creation of the dual sphere of influence. However, although reasons can be cited to show how these elements may have caused heightened tensions, it ignores when conditions around these elements were called politically and how they connected to the bigger picture. From where I stand, it is almost impossible to blame one particular aspect on the Peloponnesian War breaking out. Geopolitical relationships are complex, and especially when looking back over a period going over 50 years in the past, there is going to be a complex web of interactions, developments, and situations that are going to occur that would come to influence both cities as they move forward. I think the whole question around the causes for the Peloponnesian War can be summed up quite well in an analogy that Donald Kagan provides around the notion of a powder keg. This was the analogy we used when beginning our episode with the Epidamnus affair, and what could be seen as the immediate developments. Kagan says, "The growth of the Athenian Empire and Sparta's jealousy and fear of it provided the flammable material that ignited into the First Peloponnesian War. The 30 Years' Peace poured water on that flame and extinguished it. What was left of the flammable material was continually cooled and dampened by the mutual restraint of Athens and Sparta in the decade 445 to 435. To start the war, the spark of the Epidamnum trouble needed to land on one of those rare bits of flammable stuff that had not yet been thoroughly drenched. Therefore, it needed to be continually and vigorously fanned by the Corinthians, soon assisted by the Megarians, Plataeans, Aegiatans, and the Spartan war party. Even then, the spark might have extinguished had not the Athenians provided some additional fuel." Hi all, just a quick note on our next release. I'm heading off on holidays, so I'll be taking a short break from releasing the next series episode. This will see that there will be no new episode in mid-July. However, we'll be back on track with the series picking back up at the end of July. For those of you over on Patreon, there will be no interruption to the bonus episode releases, since they occur at the start of each month. Thank you everyone for your continued support, and a big shout out to all those who have found some value in the series and have been supporting it on Patreon and other various ways. Your contribution is truly helping me grow the series. If you have also found some value in the show and wish to support the series, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the Support the Series button, where you can discover many ways to extend your support to helping the series grow. Be sure to stay connected and updated on what's happening in the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. And be sure to subscribe to the series over the Casting Through Ancient Greece website. I hope you can join me next time, where we continue the narrative in the series with episode 74, Attica Invaded.